I will start the recording. So good morning. I can see William. I know it's late in the night. No, in the morning. It's very early in the morning. So William is also the co-coordinator of the TG. I don't know if William wanna say something. Only to say.
No, well, good morning for those who are in this side of the world. Thank you very much, Arunima, for the presentation. We're looking forward. No, and this is really it's called dialogue because we want to enter in a dialogue together. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would like only to thank you, William, and everybody for being here. I would like to say goodbye, especially to Sarianafi, who is joining us in this moment. And we would like to say that we are very close to, yes, to all Lebanese people. And yes, so feel us with you. Sari, hi. Thank you for being here. And I would like also to thank you for being with us. And I would like to say goodbye also to Eva Sotomayor. Hola, Eva.
Hi. Hi.
Hi, thank you for being here, for joining us and everybody.
It's a pleasure to me.
Thank you very much for being here. So only a short presentation of Arunima. She's professor at the Center for Women's Studies, the School of Social Sciences, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi in India. Her research focuses on especially India's historical and contemporary context, examining cultural, visual, and material texts, as well as contemporary politics. Key areas include family, kinship, aesthetics of modernity, visual culture, and religious practices. And now she's talking with us about compassion. And so I will leave the floor to you. Thank you very much, Arunima.
Thank you, Sylvia, for having me, for having invited me. I am so happy to be here with all of you. I'm sorry I couldn't join the discussions on the World Love Index, which I had wanted to. There were things that came up at that time and I missed those meetings. I really wanted to be part of that too. Hopefully this will start another kind of discussion. When Sylvia wrote to me asking whether I would present some of my work for this, I thought I would use this opportunity to speak about something that I had been thinking about for a while, though I had not written. So please do, forgive me for something that is entirely preliminary. These are very, very early thoughts on what I have rather vaguely, I think, titled The Idioms of Compassion and the Language of Resistance in Contemporary India. Now, as some of you know, and I see that a few of my own friends have actually joined the meeting, so I thank them also very much. And I thank everybody who's part of this meeting and is part of this dialogue. There have been two different occasions in a little over the last decade or more, when some of us have been thinking about the idea of love. One of these was a long conversation over 4 different workshops as part of what we subsequently published under the name of Love and Revolution. Patricia Hayes and Pramesh Lalu from the University of the Western Cape, and I edited that volume. And these were workshops that were held in 3 different continents, actually, in South Africa, in the United States, and in New Delhi. And most of that set of reflections, as you can imagine from the title, was really to do with questions about political love. And the second sort of my engagement with this idea of love came a couple of years back, which is when I met Sylvia and Gennaro at Beirut. when I was trying to track the idea of the comrade for a workshop on labors of love, trials of friendship, thinking about the challenges of the modern social relation. Now, in the Love and Revolution volume, this is just to sort of put some of my own work in perspective in relation to this. My contribution, which I'd call the Love Commandment, was really to try and understand why, from the colonial period, the colonial state and the Indian state has tried to the form in which the state has repressed dissent and to control dissent. And I had looked at 3 different moments in Indian history, sort of looking back at the idea and the ways in which the idea of disaffection is actually woven into the language of law and used to regulate dissent. So in that sense, disaffection or dissent then becomes a way of seeing the people as not loving the state. It's a negative in that sense. In other words, being unpatriotic or anti-national. And there, I had looked at Gandhi and then a couple of sort of examples in the post-colonial context. The second time I had sort of thought about the question about love was the paper that I had done on the idea of the comrade, trying to historicize the Communist Party in Kerala, which is on the southwestern coast of India. And for at least some of you would know, there is still a kind of parliamentary Communist Party there. So it was trying to historicize the Communist Party of Kerala's, in Kerala's attempt to use the term Sakhava or comrade, the Malayalam term for comrade, to see if, and my attempt was to see if the purported aims of the party of erasure of identification, be it of caste or class, gender, religion, etc., and to achieve equality, whether both of these were workable with the use of the term. And also to see what kinds of possibilities the term itself might have possessed and what it could have actually opened up, the sort of histories of that. Now, in this presentation, I'm moving away from both of these kinds of contexts. And as I said in the beginning, it's a very, very preliminary first attempt to think through a very different kind of invocation of love in contemporary India and also in the world, both as act and speech acts. So what I will focus on here today is to look at the Sikh tradition. The Sikhs are a religious group, a small religious group in India, and they are a very small percentage of the world population. But there is something quite extraordinary in the ways in which they have come forward to extend solidarity via shared food, langar, or the use of the community kitchen, about which I will speak a little bit more later. Now, I want to, as I develop this, I want to actually put that in conversation with 2 other kinds of iterations of love, which I'm not going to open up in this paper, but I'm thinking about. One is looking at an activist group called Karwane Mohabbat. And Mohabbat, as some of you will know, means love. And also thinking about the manner in which a contemporary Indian politician, Rahul Gandhi, has invoked love repeatedly, or mohabbat. And both Karwane Mohabbat and Rahul Gandhi have used this as part of political and social strategies. Now, in the case of Karwane Mohabbat, the manner in which they invoke love is a mode of retrieving humanity. They try and use it to build solidarity. And also it is an attempt to build affective communities of resistance, particularly to nurture those affected by hate crimes. And as at least some of you would know, India has been witnessing an escalated amount of bigotry, Islamophobia, and particularly brutalized forms of enactments of Islamophobia in the form of speech acts and actual lynching and murder and so on and so forth. And Karwan-e-Mohabbat is trying to imagine a world beyond this new normal of socially and politically divisive hatred, both in terms of religious and caste hatred. Now, in Rahul Gandhi's case, the term Mohabbat, which he invokes repeatedly as he says that he's trying to set up a shop of love, Mohabbat ki dukaan, in the bazaar, in the marketplace of hatred. Nafrat ke bazaar mein, he says, I'm trying to set up, we are trying to set up a Mohabbat ki dukaan. Now, what is less explicit in his invocation of the term Mohabbat, and I need to think far more about this, is that it doesn't lead to a condemnation of hate crimes or bigotry, but is far more inchoate, though rather well-meaning. It's a well-meaning invocation of a common humanity. But both Karwan-e-Mohabbat and Rahul Gandhi, I'm setting aside for the time being. And I want to go back to think about social love. I want to think about acts of social love by looking at the way in which Langar Seva, or the service of providing food via community kitchens by the Sikhs, is, the way in which it has what can I say? It has developed its own idiom of not just social love, but also of a profoundly humane form of enacting solidarities. Now, the Sikhs as a religious group emerged in the 16th century, and I'm not doing a history of that. I'm by no means competent to do that. I'm not trained as a historian who studies Northwestern India. I do not know Punjabi, so everything that I have used is really based on secondary sources. But it's just using this as a site for thinking about social love. They come up in Punjab, which is on the northwestern part of India, and they emerge as a process of rejection of mainstream orthodoxies of the two then dominant religious traditions, Hinduism and Islam, even as they invoked subaltern ideas of resistance that were prevalent in both. So, forms of thinking about the self in terms of a sublation with the divine that you can't get within both the Sufi and the Bhakti movements, which are, not based on a kind of prioritization of the deity. What I want to do here is, sort of think with what had moved me. I mean, there is a very powerful and moving, what one can call a spiritual, social, political act of love that seems to be intrinsic to the community sense of self. And that can be encapsulated in the term which they use, a term that is familiar in India, that of seva or service. And I will use particularly the idea of Langar Seva to address two main questions. What does it represent? And what possibilities does it open up for us in the contemporary moment? These are the two kinds of questions with which I am trying to think about Langar Seva. Now, the two models of Langar that we witness is one, of course, is within the holy place of the Sikhs, the Gurudwara. And, again, some of you might know that, the Sikhs, unlike the Hindus, they are not idol worshippers. They do not worship any kind of concrete or abstract form of God. They have a sense of the preceptor, the teacher, the guru, and also of the holy book. And the holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib, is a compilation of hymns that were composed over a period of 2 to 3 centuries, perhaps certainly by the first 6 and maybe more gurus. And it's a compilation of these. And within the Gurudwara, which is of course open to anybody, every day, and in the context of the big Gurudwaras in northern part of India, in Delhi itself, there are Gurudwaras that feed anywhere between 35 to 40,000 people every day. Every single Gurudwara is feeding that many people. In Amritsar, where the best known and most revered of the Gurudwaras is, 100,000 people are fed every single day. So there is this idea of nourishment for all, right? The use of food as a way of showing care. But one has seen Sikhs via their different kinds of formations and groups like Langar Aid, Khalsa Aid, and so on and so forth. There's several groups, international Sikh organizations, where they have extended as acts of care and extension of solidarity. They have provided langar to French farmers and truckers when they were protesting against the EU's sort of unfair hiking of prices of vegetables, which caused great sort of difficulties for farmers. During the COVID-19 in the United Kingdom, I mean, in India, of course, but I'm citing some of the kinds of examples that we know from across the world. During Black Lives Matter protests in both the US and in UK, within India, when the big citizenship rights protests were taking place, some years ago, the Indian state was trying through, bringing in certain kinds of laws that would actually, in time, reduce Muslims within the country to second-class citizenship. There were big protests across the country, mostly led by Muslims, but largely, protests in which Muslims and non-Muslims join. In these, one of the best known of these protest sites was a place in Delhi called Shaheen Bagh, where the protests were led by Muslim women. And Sikh farmers walked from Punjab to Delhi to set up langar for the protesters. Then, of course, there were huge farmers' protests in the country between 2020 to 2021, protesting anti-farmer laws that were brought in by the Indian state, which were finally rolled back. But even in that, there were various forms of langar, but also very creative forms of langar, like turban langar and so on and so forth and all of that. Now, what is this idea of social love or care or solidarity that one can see if one tries to understand the notion of seva? Now, seva, as it is sort of both understood and unpacked by different Sikh and non-Sikh sort of scholars who have been trying to understand it and study it, it's understood as an ethical, a spiritual, and a political idea, which is rooted within the Sikh tradition. And very often, people will cite the original teacher, the original guru, Guru Nanak, who's meant to have started the tradition itself. He says that he who eats what he has earned by his own labor and gives some to others, Nanak, he it is who knows the true way. Now, historically, the meaning of langar links it to selflessness, to service, to community, and a form of subjectivity that was linked to piety, as in service to the service of the guru, as well as service of the community or sangat. And the phrase that any Sikh will tell you about in terms of their own understanding of their own tradition is the phrase is Kirat karo, naam japo, vante chakho, which is to say, work hard, recite the name, divide the proceeds of one's labor. By the mid-20th century, the modern version of the Sikh Rahat Maryada, this was finalized in 1950. They say Rahat Maryada means the sort of, what shall we say, a template for living, a conduct manual, if you wish. They say that the importance of seva is not merely a matter of waving fans or serving food in the langar or community kitchen. A Sikh should devote his entire life to the welfare of others. So in many ways, what we see are 2 or 3 different kinds of things coming together. There is an idea of self-formation, but at the same time, a desire to transform the world, of service to God and the Guru, but also an idea of invoking the social, the ethics of service that seva is meant to be founded on, is also continuously invoking the idea of the social or the idea of the community. Now, it is worth mentioning before I go on to discuss some other thinkers who have been engaging the idea of seva, that the notion of seva is not unknown to other traditions within India. Other traditions of seva existed and they continue to exist, both historically and in the contemporary moment. But what I find actually quite striking now that I've been reading and thinking about this for a while now, about the Sikh idea of seva, is that it differs quite dramatically, not only in as an idea, but also in the history of its practice, as a lived practice, from these other traditions of seva that exist within India. The political thinker R. Srivatsan has done a very useful tracking of this in his provocative, productive, and sometimes problematic essay called Concept of Seva and the Sevak in the Freedom Movement, which he wrote about a couple of decades ago. Now, I want to focus on 2 kinds of ideas of seva. One which he discusses, the idea of Gandhian seva. And the other idea that I want to actually briefly sort of address here, and I will not be developing that in this presentation, which is the idea of the sevak or seva in the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, which is the sort of cultural, political sort of bulwark of the right-wing Hindu nationalist forces in India. And they too have an idea of service that is sort of intrinsic to their own formation. So what is this idea of service that you get from Gandhi and from the right wing, which is different from the Sikh idea? So that's again something that I want to sort of very quickly flag here. Now, within Gandhi, there are various strands that come together and they get transformed. And one important part of this is his observation and sometimes criticism of Christian missionaries and the work that they did with the indigenous communities in India, with the Adivasis. And he uses this to think about the way in which caste discrimination, the social status differentiation within India based on one's, community of birth. So the caste hierarchy and caste discrimination, and he, an early iteration of this, his idea of seva can be found within the idea of Harijan seva. Harijans were the erstwhile untouchable groups, the social groups, whom he tried to sort of, work with in order to remove this sort of untouchability and, what Srivatsan calls Harijan Seva within Gandhi was a key instrument for reparation and repentance for the sins of Hindu history. Now, of course, within the Gandhian idea, the sevak, or the one who performed their duty or seva, was upper caste. The site for expiation of moral corruption of Hindus was the untouchable society, right? So they were people who were passive and to be reformed through the kind of goodwill and acts of duty that were to be performed by the upper caste. But by the 1940s, Gandhi expanded this into what then became the constructive program of the Indian National Congress. And that actually described the various areas that had to be repaired. And this was a very wide spectrum of tasks, which included women's emancipation, the uplift of indigenous communities, and harmonious living between Hindus and Muslims, amongst many, many others. Now, when one moves to the Hindu rights idea of seva, and I have recently begun reading a very interesting work by Malini Bhattacharjee, and her work on the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and she specifically looks at the idea of seva within this, and the way in which the idea of, and she shows how the idea of selfless service becomes very capacious and has helped the political mobilization of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh for building the Hindu Rashtra, the Hindu nation. Which is to say, they are using the idea of service to all in order to actually to make India a nation of some. So it's very ironic how the idea of selfless service is actually not so selfless after all, it's very motivated. Now, what is interesting about the way in which they invoke the idea of seva is that it is, for them, it's important to assert the indigeneity of the term, that seva is something that comes from within the Indian kind of conceptual vocabulary, shall we say. And they distinguish it from charity and philanthropy, which they associate with Christianity and the West. And very recently, in a very long and important piece done by a journalist for, one of our very significant sort of magazines which engages politics, The Caravan, a senior Rashtriya Swayamsevak functionary, Shankar Das, he's one of the intellectual heads, Bauddhik Pramukh. He said that their seva division was one of the 6 pillars whose ultimate aim, and at this I'm quoting him, he says that the ultimate aim of the seva vibhag, the service division, is to work cohesively to establish the Hindu Rashtra, the Hindu nation. So clearly, even though the idea of seva was known within the context of India and has been developed differently by Gandhi or the Hindu right, the Sikh idea is quite distinct from this. And I turn now to a scholar activist based in the US. He is American. He's an American Sikh, Simranjeet Singh, whose very recent book I've just begun to read, The Light We Give. but who has been writing quite a lot, and I've read a little bit of his work. And he thinks about seva as justice work. And he writes about Sikh volunteers who provide free food, water, and shelter to, and he details a range of contexts to Rohingya refugees escaping state brutality in Myanmar, Sikh volunteers who go to the Syrian border, to the Kurdish town of Duhok, and set up bakeries to feed Syrian and Iraqi refugees when they were fleeing the war about a decade ago. And the question that Singh asks is, why is it that the Sikhs are the ones who are a very tiny percentage of the world population? Why are they at the forefront of humanitarian crisis, and to which I add political protest? And to quote him, he says, and this is a quote from him, he says, "From hurricanes and tsunamis to floods and terrorist attacks, why is this the case? Their altruism comes from the tradition of seva, a practice of justice work that is at the very core of the Sikh tradition." Now, Simranjeet Singh speaks of the Sikh worldview as one that sees the world in terms of interconnectedness, where there is no difference between self and the other. And I quote him again. He says, "The Sikh idea of seva then brings together the realms of spirituality and justice. This concept is so central to the tradition that Sikhi means the lessons we learn. But it's used to refer to Sikh knowledge also. So he says the Sikh idea of seva then brings together the realms of spirituality and justice. This concept is so central to the tradition that Sikhi coined its own terms to articulate this worldview. For example, some of the first vocabulary words I learned as a child included seva simran, which is service remembrance, miri piri, political spiritual, Sant Sipahi, saint soldier. Every Sikh is expected to cultivate their own spirituality while also serving the communities around them. Now, I'll come back to Simranjeet Singh again later, because I find him actually a very thoughtful, deeply political, but also somebody whose spiritual idiom is unfamiliar to the kinds of politics I have understood or been a participant of. So it's very interesting to try and learn from and think with somebody who comes from a very different kind of orientation. But I want to turn to the political thinker and scholar Balso Khibuli, based in the UK. And she says, and her piece called Seva is Radical Friendship on Foucault's Spirituality and the Farmers' Protest. So she is looking at langar as an act of what she calls radical friendship. And she's looking at the ways in which political spirituality and radical friendship emerged during the farmers' movement. And she takes us back to langar, or the community kitchen, and sangat, or the community, but also engages Foucault's ideas of friendship. And she, for this particular task, she's looking at Foucault's Iranian writings, his last volume of the History of Sexuality, and his very last lecture in the Collège de France. So there are two elements that she isolates within this. She reads Foucault's ideas of friendship as one, counter-conduct or refusal, and the second as ethical care or care of the self that encompasses spiritual practice. Now, she arrives at the conceptual formulation of radical friendship by bringing within the same frame seva and the Foucauldian ideas of friendship. But she supplements Foucault's ideas, which are in themselves his ideas of friendship are, underlining the importance of non-institutional resistant modes of being, But she supplements that with an ethics of seva. And this she interprets through what she calls radical Sikhi. And I quote her here, she says, to mean an ethic of care or service for the other that demands sacrifice of the ego self and that can promise mutual flourishing through political spiritual practices such as langar. Now, both Sokhi Boli and Simranjeet Singh invoke the idea of Miri Piri or the spiritual political to emphasize langar as a practice of equality and liberation or truthful living, and cooking and feeding at protest sites as a source of material and spiritual nourishment. And she says that it builds solidarities and has sustained the sites of notably the farmers' movement in India and the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK and the United States. But seva at protest sites isn't restricted, as I said earlier, to langar alone, but includes many other collective nourishing practices and rituals. And, in her exploration, she looks at the, very interesting examples of male farmers massaging the hands of women farmers who had been making the Indian flatbread roti. And also, more importantly, to protesters caring for the very officers who targeted them with tear gas and water cannons. Now, how is this actually possible? And this is actually a really very serious question. And, I was reminded of the kind of discussions and writing that has happened over a long period of time on the idea of solidarity, which has come from largely within the kind of left canon, but also from feminists and so on. And I went back to look at an important discussion in this context, which came in a special issue on solidarity in the Women's Studies Quarterly, which is edited by Shefali Chandra and Sadia Tur. And they are looking at very difficult political contexts, particularly with regard to transnational solidarity and so on and so forth, and looking at the ways in which solidarity can fray and, very particularistic kinds of ideas of solidarity. And they are specifically looking at feminists extending certain kinds of solidarity, for example, after the US attacks on Afghanistan and so on and so forth, where say US-based or left-wing feminists were willing to extend solidarity to Afghani women, but not see the problems of, empire itself or the kind of violence perpetrated on Afghanistan by the US and many other countries prior to that. So, what I found was that while I'm far more familiar with those discussions and the impossibilities of certain kinds and the limits of certain kinds of acts of political solidarity, I have tried to, and this is, as I said, this is so preliminary, I cannot even, so I just have a few final thoughts. I don't have a conclusion or anything like that, but I have been thinking about this question of if at all it is possible to think about solidarity or social love, for that matter, in a different idiom, in an idiom that is unfamiliar to us. How do we defamiliarize our own kinds of political vocabularies, the ways in which we understand forms of doing politics, how we think about the social, what does it, what space does it even have within the sort of larger left or feminist sort of spaces that many of us inhabit. So, so in that light, and which is why I turned to Langar Seva, because I have been deeply moved by the fact of these Sikh volunteers just charging off wherever it is and just quietly, without drawing attention to themselves, just feeding people who are protesting or in dire difficulties. It doesn't even have to be protest sites. They have done it in all manners of contexts. So what kinds of subjectivities and modes of living in the world does this form of seva or service or social love, if you want to call it, allow us? And the three important takeaways from the kinds of discussions that I've been trying to lay out here are the ethics of care and service, the manner in which seva is a recognition of the dignity and rights of freedom of the other, right? And Miri Piri, the political spiritual way of being, that is the foundation of Sikhi. Now, in the paper that I had done about the comrade, where I was trying to track the genealogy and the political use of the term comrade, I had attempted to think a little about the idea of solidarity. The difference there was that the solidarity of equals that the term comrade invokes is one that assumes a difference in sides. One may only be a comrade of someone on the same side as part of the larger transformatory struggle waged by the comradely. This is in spite of the fact that far more than ever before, contemporary political struggles waged by citizens, and here I was thinking more about Indian citizens, by Indian students or citizens, invoke the need for love and compassion. And we hear this constantly. And I think it's because we are so saturated by the kind of hatreds that we all are living through, that people are turning to the need for love and the need for political love or compassion and so on. But despite that, this call for love or compassion is often accompanied, perhaps with good reason, for a demand to rise in rage and a warning that sab yaad rakha jayega, everything, every atrocity that is, will be remembered. The question then is, can one love the enemy or be their friend? In a world where increasingly the cost of both repression and political struggle is violence and carceral justice, can the comradely assumption of sides in struggle accommodate an idea of loving friendship? Now, I turned at that time to look at the work of two Indian scholars who have been writing quite recently, within the last couple of decades, on these kinds of ideas of love, Susan Vishwanathan and Leela Gandhi. And their work is significant and insightful because they are trying to study Indian nationalism, specifically anti-colonial thought, within a framework that explores the forging of unexpected and radical political friendship. What did it mean to form deep friendships with people across racial and national divisions, especially when they are also in a relationship of colonizer and colonized? Could friendship transform, or for that matter, transcend this relationship? Both these works suggest that friendship makes possible ways of rethinking anti-colonialism that aren't forever bounded by a rhetoric of antagonistic resistance. Both scholars explore a terrain of intimacy that brought together people across racial, national, and religious difference. And as Leela Gandhi says with great poignancy, friendship is the one name for co-belonging for non-identical singularities. And it is this co-belonging of non-identical singularities that I'm reminded of in the context of the repeated acts of Langar Seva practiced by Sikhs worldwide, where acts of extending sustenance and care seems more eloquent than the worthiest of political speeches on solidarity. It is an attempt to think about small acts and minor notes, as indeed about new modes of living and loving, in order to imagine new cultures of resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Very, very interesting. What about the video? Would you like to
Yes,
show
if
it now?
you would, yes, that would be wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much, please.
Perfect. Okay. 1 second. She would like to share with us the video. So 1 second, so I can close this.
Guru Nanak Sahib started langar with 20 rupees, and because of his blessings, we're to serve langar to millions of people across the world. The World Sikh Parliament is doing seva by providing langar, face masks, and hand sanitizers to the people during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been doing this seva since March 22nd, 2020.
हमारे जो गुरु साहबान है, गुरु नानक साहब जी और 10 गुरु साहबान, उनकी जो शिक्षा है कि जब कहीं भी विश्व में कोई आफत आती है तो उस वक्त जैसी भी नीड्स होती है लोगों की, तो सिख समुदाय खालसा पंथ हमेशा सामने आता है.
Till now, we have served around 147,000 meals only in New York. But if we combine all the United States, we have served more than 200,000 meals.
वेजिटेरियन मील्स होते हैं तो उसमें हम बनाते हैं मटर पनीर होता है, राजमा होते हैं और जैसे दूसरी सब्जी होती है, मिक्स वेजिटेबल्स होती हैं और पास्ता होता है, अमेरिकन डिश होती है और साथ ही साथ उसमें खीर डिजर्ट के तौर पे वो भी हम तैयार करते हैं. अभी तक 1,47,000 लोगों को हम खाना दे चुके हैं और उसके साथ साथ जैसे ग्रोसरी है, 50,000 फैमिली को ग्रोसरी जिसमें कैन फूड होते हैं, फ्रूट्स होते हैं, जो दाल वगैरह होती है वो सभी देते हैं. तो जो चर्च हैं अमेरिका में, चर्च एवरी चर्च के आगे बड़ी बड़ी लंबी लाइनें लगती थी. हॉस्पिटल में जो लोग डॉक्टर हैं, नर्सें हैं, वो उन लोगों की टेक केयर कर रही थी, उन लोगों को देख रहे थे जो मरीज थे. तो हमने देखा कि हम भी इस चीज़ में योगदान पा सके, तो हमने डॉक्टरों को, नर्सों को खाना दिया हॉस्पिटलों में. और ऐसे ही जैसे होमलेस लोग हैं जो शेल्टर बिल्डिंग्स है गया उनमें रहते हैं, तो उन लोगों को भी हमने खाना दिया है. जो रेसिज्म का केस है उसके खिलाफ भी पूरे अमेरिका में प्रोटेस्ट हुए हैं. तो हम लोगों ने जहां पीसफुल प्रोटेस्ट थे, जहां कोई वायलेंट नहीं हो रहा था, तो वहां भी हम लोगों ने जो अपना गुरु का लंगर है, प्रसाद है, तो वो भी वहाँ देना शुरू किया.
We're out here with lots of people and they called, they volunteered, they offered to provide cooked meals. So I think they're doing a great job and I thank them for coming out here today and joining us in our pantry.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
The World Sikh Parliament doesn't go out on a daily basis to serve langar, but it depends on the approaches we get. So we get approaches 4 to 5 times a week, and we go out to serve people. We cook meals starting at 4 a.m. and we distribute them later in the day.
30 से 35 वॉलंटियर है, सभी यंग बच्चे, नौजवान बच्चे होते हैं और ये हम मेक श्योर करते हैं कि कोई भी बच्चा बीमार ना हो, कि वो दूसरे लोगों को भी बीमार कर सकता है, तो उस चीज़ों का हम ख्याल रखते हैं.
We haven't faced any difficulties while serving langar because we're trying to take precautions as much as we can. We're trying to wear gloves, masks, and sanitizing ourselves frequently and take precautions. We're also trying to limit the number of volunteers that come and help us out to practice social distancing. We're also following the guidelines issued by the CDC in the United States.
तो अलग-अलग लोग जो जहाँ जरूरत थी, जिनकी नीड थी, उन लोगों को हम लोगों ने खालसा पंथ ने लंगर दिया.
We direct to certain locations where it is easy for people to access the meal. Usually when we go, there are long lines extending from one block to another waiting for the langar to be served. Serving meals and providing groceries to thousands of families was possible because of the Sikh community giving nature. Langar was founded on the principle of equality of all, regardless of gender, color, caste, religion, or social status. Guru Nanak Sahib started this langar from 20 rupees, and this langar is feeding millions of people all across the world.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Dinos, and we want to wish the Sikh community a happy Vasiki.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like, those, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much. So I think the floor is open. We've understood a little bit better how is this. So the floor is open for the discussion.
May I?
Yes, of course. Hello, Felipe.
Hi to see everyone. And thank you so much for this beautiful talk and a lot of thoughts. And I would like to perhaps hear something more about some possible consequence of the whole concept of seva and so on. So how do you think? I was thinking about two issues. One, I have been dealing and discussing with colleagues who have been working the critical theory of caste. And it's a very interesting discussion on how perhaps it's interesting how seva is before, as I understood it correctly, before the very idea of caste and or different kinds of division. So it's more how to be together, right? So is that any possible way of pushing from that for a more comprehensive idea of critic, of social critic? That would be one consequence or some thought. The other is about reparation. And I'm working also with some colleagues and we organized in Germany an interesting workshop on reparation, and there was also a colleague from India. And yeah, I was thinking perhaps so because this is also some kind of inequality in a way, but in that sense, working about the past, the role of the past, historical justice, and how this could be also interesting or valuable for this kind of critique about the historical consequence of injustice in the present. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So let me, the second is a slightly more difficult question, largely because the question of reparation is not very big within Indian discussions in the way in which it has emerged within different African contexts and so on. Mainly because in relation to what you were raising earlier, which is the question of caste. Now, there are two kinds of ways in which I want to actually respond to the question about caste. One is caste in relation to Sikhism. Now, and that is not what this paper is about at the moment, but it is something that it will need to engage it certainly as I wish to develop this, which is in its ideal form, conceptually, Sikhism disavows caste. It is meant to be beyond caste. And that's where the langar becomes an interesting kind of practice. So if one looks at the practice of seva, langar is an interesting practice because you do not stop anybody at the doors of a gurdwara. You don't make any discrimination in terms of who you go to feed. When you take food in the context of, whether it's the COVID pandemic or other kinds of contexts, when you take food to feed people and so on and so forth and all of that, there is no caste discrimination there. However, having said that, both, scholars who have been working not on the idea of seva and the way in which that animates a certain kind of Sikhi, there are very, very strong critiques of both from the point of view of caste and gender in relation to the Sikhs also. right? So it's not something that one can walk away from. But what I wanted to do, normally when it's very difficult, of course, partly because I was beginning to think about this in relation to social love, and I found, and the reason I chose this is because in the last many years now, certainly in the last 5 years, I have repeatedly seen Sikhs going out and doing this work. And it is something that has been deeply, deeply intriguing because there is a quality of self-effacement, unlike, say, the Hindu Right Organization, RSS, which draws attention to the fact that they have done all these good acts of service and so on and so forth. So there is something about that that was very intriguing, apart from the fact that they also extend the same solidarity in the context of protests. It's not just, natural disasters and, pandemics, etc., and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it was an interesting question. But so from the point of view of so what can we then do with Seva? I think as a possible future, what is if there's a way in which one can mobilize this idea without necessarily exalting it. I think the way might be to think about what it offers us in terms of a sort of way of being in the world that is both about self-effacement and service, but also in terms of remaking oneself through the act of social love. And I think that if that can be then built back into a critique of caste within Sikhism, not just India generally, which is, of course, still deeply, deeply caste-ridden, then that would be a really productive way in which one can sort of use this just as much as other kinds of concepts have arisen, sisterhood, for example, within feminism and so on. So, I mean, there are attempts to dispel distinction. There is a kind of aspiration for equality and sameness without, and that sameness not being one that, without necessarily trivializing the kinds of differences that might actually exist. So I think if there is a way in which one can utilize Seva to begin thinking about one's own locations of privilege and how one can actually disturb that in order, it's also about self-remaking. If I were to engage in Seva, for example, what would it do to me, not just what I would do for others? Right? It's not, so, how would I be remade within a sort of political vocabulary of that kind? It's not something that I know because I do not come out of those kinds of formations, but it's an attempt to think with that. But, your question about, caste is actually, I think, and since you've been discussing this with, you've been engaging people working with critical theories of caste, I think that's a very, very important question to be asked. Reparation, as I said, there has been a little discussion on, the erstwhile untouchable groups, the Dalits, speaking about reparations and so on, but it has never become a big enough debate within the Indian context. Perhaps because so much of our discussions are still trying to address the question of different forms of violence and violation, that then, how to write the and the other thing, of course, is that the right wing is the one that has taken on this business of writing historical wrongs. And they speak about that in terms of the historical wrongs done by Muslims in India. So, and they see that as a way of attacking, of extending their Islamophobia. So then so the past as a site for reparation, it's very interesting that without using the term, they are the ones who occupy that. And from the other side, you do not have enough of a discussion of that kind. So I don't know whether that's an answer to your question, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
Thank you
But
so
thank
much. Yeah, that's very illuminating. Thank you.
Lakshmi?
Yeah, thank you. Anu, I'm not going to put on my video because
Okay,
of
that's fine.
connection.
It's
I have a historical question.
Please don't ask
One
me about
is
the history of the
that,
Sikhs. I will fail.
No. It's not going to be history of the Sikhs at all. I'm just thinking to myself, if you look at the ways in which from the late 19th and early 20th century, the notion of seva becomes pretty integral to a variety of organizations that I do not want to immediately dub as right-wing. So if you take the Bharat Sevashram, if you take the Ramakrishna Mission, if you take even the Anjumani Jamaat, you have a series of organizations that suddenly start thinking about seva as part of a political vocabulary they're engaging with. So I am curious to know, what is it about this idea that lends itself to a certain form of political affiliation? So it's not just giving, it's not dan, it's not khairat, but it is seva. So it sort of comes back to what you were saying in response to Philippe, which is it does something to you. It's not just that you're giving something, but when you are participating in this kind of individual stroke collective, social, something is happening. And therefore, I'm curious to know how that evolves, because surely the seva of 1820, the seva of Gurudwara at Amritsar at a particular time, and the seva now are obviously different. So when Simranjit Singh is talking about justice work, he's obviously saying that in relation to a very contemporary constellation of factors.
Absolutely.
And obviously something is mobilized, something has been galvanized for him to talk about this. So I'm kind of curious about how then, as a historian, one should be reading the work of Langar in Delhi or in Shaheen to the kind of political movements that we are looking at. You know, this is a question that it's not specific only to what you're doing. It's a question that I'm also very aware of. You know, I'm always posing this when I speak to my friends who do serious Ambedkarite studies, who use Buddhist terminology like Maitri, like Sangha, to speak about very relevant contemporary issues. And obviously, you can't have a seamless continuity. You speak to a Buddhist scholar, he's not going to recognize what we are saying or recognize the political salience that has been, that animates these terms. So while I understand that there is a certain capacity in this kind of terminology to be able to deal with political discrimination, I'm asking you the question, what does the Langar do for us in the contemporary moment for issues of obvious discrimination, great, crises, whether it's political or natural or climatic? And what is it about the Langar Seva that is so different from the kind of Seva that you would find? And I'm not thinking of the RSS alone, but I'm thinking of a whole lot of other organizations that continue to do Seva, transcending caste and community.
Thank you so much. All very relevant. And let me try to respond to this, not directly, but slightly indirectly, which is to say that, when I began to look at it, my familiarity and my excitement about Langar Seva started with, the very improbable political context in which Langar was being done, and which is the political sides, right? Whether it's anti-CAA protests at Shaheen Bagh or, whether it's after the riots in the northeast of Delhi, whether it's Black Lives Matter, any number of these kinds of distinctions. Sorry, I have the questions open. I'm going to shut it down because I get distracted by trying to read and respond at the same time. So whether any of the kinds of contexts, the Rohingya refugees going to, the Syrian border and so on, that Simranjit Singh is speaking about and so on. And also Balso Ki Boli, both of them, it's very interesting how they pick up on particular kinds of political sides, but then try and respond. So this is what I want to do, which is try and think with the logic of what they are trying to lay out and what I can try and do to understand that, and sort of disturb my own kind of set of expectations of what I think this is or it ought to be, right? So partly it's also defamiliarizing oneself from the kinds of ways in which one might actually read langar. Right? Why are you going to feed people? Why do you think food sustenance is so important? Why is that the kind of seva? Right? It's so, and I think that there is something about the centrality of food and the materiality of food for social and political life, and the way in which that animates the Sikh imagination, which I think is a political lesson that we might want to think with. The second is this business of the effacement, which they all speak about, the effacement of the ego self, right? So there is Simranjit Singh is actually very interesting because he also speaks about the contradictions within that kind of idea and where it works and where it doesn't work, etc., etc. I agree with you. And I think that is what I too was responding to, which is that clearly what is happening in the context of the Singh Sabha movement and so on and so forth, and, langar that was being done then is very different from the langar that is being done now. But the world has changed as well, right? So there is a way in which this kind of seva, I think in terms of imagining a social world rather than fronting a political crisis, right? It's bringing back the idea of humanity when we've had many of us come out of political movements that have had a very big critique of the human, right? Including in the human rights discourse and the rights discourse and all of those kinds of things. So I think there is something about the humaneness of humanity and the idea of a socius that they are trying to stress continuously. The fact that we will feed even the people who were hitting us with water cannons and tear gas and so on and so forth. So during the farmers' protest, this is something that was actually happening, which is that they were feeding the soldiers as well of the Indian army and so on, and the police and so on and so forth. Which is something in most of our movements we cannot think about. We actually find that weak from our own political positioning. But what if we flip that around? Is there a way in which one can disarm conflict through a different kind of alignment of how we think about our political or social selves? Those are the questions that this brings up for me, and let me leave it there.
Lakshmi, it's a dialogue. So if you wanna tell us something more, yeah.
That's okay.
I reply, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So not only questions.
Okay, okay.
Thank you for your important intervention. And then contribution. The floor is open. Someone else?
Hi, Sylvia.
Yes.
Hello, Professor. No, I don't have a question. I just would like to remind Sylvia that there is a reaction in a sort of question form on the chat by Kalyan Menon Sen. I'm wondering if Professor Arunima would like to respond to it also. Should I read
Yeah,
it or can you
I did
okay.
see that. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
okay, yeah.
I did see Kalyani's question. Thank you, Kalyani. You know, I will certainly look at Richa's, is this part of her newer work? Because I know some of her earlier work. And I must say, I heard her speak about some of this a very long time ago, when she had come to us in the Center for Women's Studies as a visiting scholar. So I must go back and look at it again. Thank you for reminding me of Richa's work. I certainly will. Thank you.
I have, if nobody has other questions or other contributions, I have a comment. Thank you very much, because it's very inspiring. And you know that we historically we started our group collecting case studies of social love, and this is one of a very interesting case. Especially because it has the four characteristics that we know that social love could have. For example, in our idea, in our work, scientific work, we base social love on 4 dimensions. The first one is overabounding. That means breaking the rules, breaking social expectations, and also, and it is interesting what you said about this, that it is not philanthropy, this is not charity, and it's something that could be interesting in this sense. They are different from the senses that we give usually to an act of love. An act of love in this sense, or an act of solidarity. And the other sense of the important dimension of overabounding could be, yes, the challenging this sense of justice. Yes, you said it is, of course, regarding the caste, but also, yes, a form of resistance, a radical friendship, and so on. So this is one case of overabounding dimension. And the other one is caring, taking care of the others and the world. This is another important dimension. And so the Langa Seva could be, of course. And also there is universalism. So the discussion about, yes, it is regardless the case, it is in favor of refugees and even the enemies. So even, for example, the enemies or the policemen or the other ones, it's interesting. It's something very challenging to take in consideration, but it's very interesting. And the recognition, for example, in the video, there was, of course, the recognition of the human nature of everybody, but also the taking care of the ones who are vegetarian, for example, going in the street and the corner next to the people, more close to the people, closer to the people who are in difficulties, and so on. So very interesting in this sense, the 4 dimensions of. But at the same time, I would like to ask you if you can a little bit say more about, because you were saying that the roots of this practice are on the Miri Piri context. And I think that especially for our current situation, the most interesting thing of Miripiri, I'm not so aware of everything, but only general concepts of this. But as I've understood, the most interesting thing and the inspiration for everybody, which is not only for a religion, is the balance between spirituality, social, civil responsibility, which means also taking care of this. You said in your speech that there is the spiritual part, but also the social, the political, So it is putting together these different dimensions, and this is not a balance. It's something very challenging and dynamic as well. And I think I don't know, could you please a little bit, yes, explain to us not only the Miripiri itself, but also, yes, these roots, but the inspiration that we can take, yes, in this, in building these new idioms of compassion and resistance.
So, when I turn to thinking about Langar Seva as a kind of instance of thinking about social love, one of the reasons, not the only one, is also because in the past couple of decades, I have been trying to study religion in the context of India. And part of that, of course, was because, this is a country that has many religions, but also because we have been, people of my generation and younger and older as well have been born into and have lived through contexts of immense interreligious violence. So, that has become the way in which we think about religion as well. And for many of us, it was also a rejection of religion that came because of this kind of close association with violence. But my attempt to study religion was to try and understand why people believe, and not why people use it to attack each other. And that has been a really interesting process for me in terms of really opening up all manners of arenas, both in terms of histories, but also in terms of practice of things that I had absolutely no idea about or familiarity with, because my everyday life as an urban sort of Indian professional living in a city, teaching in a university, my life did not circulate around these kinds of things at all. But, being exposed to all of that was actually really very interesting and important. But it also taught me that there are many commonalities, at least one of which is this idea that one should have some humility in terms of how we think about ourselves and ourselves in relation to the world and ourselves in relation to one another. And so Langar then became interesting for me to think with, because here are these people who go and do this every single day. I've watched God knows how many videos of, apart from reading about Langar context, of people who wake up early in the morning and are going there and doing, just making food. And, people who are doing it by hand, people who are, there are gurdwaras, for example, which are more modern and they have more equipment and there are mechanized means and so on and so forth. So which means they feed more people. It takes a lot of organization. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of, nutritional things brought together, but also, most importantly, it's a way by which you become almost insignificant in relation to this larger world of what you are doing, which is really thinking that, there is something about this particular form of care, this material kind of it. And that too in a country that has so much of malnutrition and malnourishment and food insecurity and all of that, to think about providing food, whatever the context might be, every single day. And there are many poor people who go every day to eat at Langar. So it's not as though that's not happening as well. It's not perhaps part of the reality for many urban privileged Indians, but it certainly is an everyday reality for poorer Indians. Other than the fact that if you're eating at a gurdwara, you might do it for an experience. Most people who live or at least a large number of people living in North India would have eaten at some Gurdwara or the other at least once in their life, partly to experience it, but partly maybe out of spiritual concerns and so on. But, this business about humility and, what is that in relation to spirituality? I think that is a issue that one does need to, I'm not sure that that is the central part of our movements even though, as I was saying earlier, there is a way in which idioms of love and compassion are being brought into at least ways in which people are trying to think about politics now. It's quite outside the purview of how we think the political. And I think this is the most challenging aspect for me, in the spiritual political, but also the ethical, because that's the other element of langar and the seva idea of langar, which is that there is a certain kind of idea of, the equality for all is not something that is based only on feeding large numbers of people every day, whoever they might be. But it's in the idea that there is an unjust world that we live in, and that there is a way in which one must think about a response to that. That actually, what shall we say, that one takes it on as something where it is our ethical response to injustice. And this is the form that they choose, right? And I think this kind of ethical response to injustice, there are many ethical responses to injustice. It's not as though that does not exist. I'm not, undermining any of those. But this ethical response to injustice is something where you are actually able to bring together all these different kinds of elements. And I think that there is a lesson there for, I say this from my location of, a certain, having been, forged within certain kinds of contexts of living and thinking politically, to ask myself, what does this teach me? How will this shape my ethical response to injustice? So and I think that that's really so it's a difficult question, really speaking. The honest answer is that, Sylvia, mainly because neither humility nor this kind of selfless acts of service is something that comes easily to us in quite the same ways, right? And I think that there is something there for us to think about. I mean, I would want to spend some time thinking about it in order to think about how Miri Piri can actually become a way of reshaping our sort of solidarities, forms of extending solidarities, the ways in which we imagine a world where perhaps our interventions may be small. They may not be very big. We may not solve every problem in the world, but small acts, which is why I ended with small acts and minor notes. Perhaps that is what one may be able to do in one lifetime. But I think that's where Miri Piri opens up that possibility, that there is a way in which we also, one of the other things that I think many of us of my generation, certainly of people who have some familiarity with Indian political context, particularly on the left or feminist context, are aware of, is that there is a great, there's a quickness with which we dismiss other forms of engagement, and there's a way in which we condemn those. In this, there is a non-condemnatory part. This business about loving your enemy as a kind of practice is very hard, actually. So how does one actually evolve a new kind of way of a resistant mode of living, a resistant mode of where loving becomes the kind of way without it, where one, tries to make a difference somewhere. That I think is the real challenge. I'm not sure whether that addressed anything that you had in mind, but yeah.
It isn't only an answer, it's a sort of discussion. And of course, there
Yes.
are, yes, very ambivalent aspects in this kind of relationship, of course. Maybe we can read something from the chat because,
Sure.
okay. First of all, I tried to give I don't know, not so, no, yes, for an explanation of the Langarseva, which I'm not sure it is very correct, but it was sort of it. Then there is, okay, thank you, Robert said, thank you for the explanation you give here in the chat box. I understand better, and it amazed how they extend help and how they put into concrete action the principles of equality, compassion, in a sense of community. And then there is Jose. Jose, yes, maybe he went away, but however, he said, thank you. In Spain now, we are having trouble with helping people in the areas of devastated with the floods because they had very big floods. Climate change.
It's terrible, actually.
Yes, 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 now in Valencia. Close to Valencia. And climate change is hitting us now, really, no matter the interpretation we have. And then he wrote, there is my reply, very inspiring thoughts. So thank you all. Social problems are global, and mostly we don't think globally. Let's try. Then there is Arunima. I'm wondering, there is Kalyani. I'm wondering if you will also be looking at conversations and experiments in feminist spaces on radical love and care as acts of resistance. Did you? Richa Nagar's work comes to mind, for example. Maybe would you like to say something about this? And then there are other two messages. I finished the messages. There are four castes division. Is one, teachers of spiritual matters. Two, protectors of society like govs and administrators. Three, business and commerce, trade. Four, labor. So its caste is defined by the nature and skill of work for community. Over the centuries, it has lost its original meaning or classification. And then Janaki Ram says, temples in the South India serve daily free lunch and dinner to all who come. Arunima, would you like to add something, especially on feminism, maybe?
No, well, I did respond to what Kalyani had asked about Richa's work earlier, and I will certainly look at that again. But I also think that, on a different, in a different manner, a different kind of response is also that, as I had said in response to Philippe's question earlier, I also think that, feminist critiques of care is something that I would certainly want to, and I think one should go back to engaging with, though of course those are contexts of far more individualized kinds of care. But I think that there are very sort of profoundly serious kinds of discussions about care and in relation to care work, and where very often care is understood as service and within familial contexts and so on and so forth and all of that. So I think that there is that's not directly about what's been asked, but I do think that is important. But I do want to go back and look at Richa's work again, because I have such a hazy memory of an early presentation that she had done for us. Yes, I agree with Kalyani's comment about you know, the gurdwaras and how they have affected many of us. I agree, actually. I fully agree with what she's saying there. Thank you, William, for the reference. I have already clicked on it now. I will go and read it. Yes, thank you so much.
So thank you very much. Willie? There is
Hi.
Gennaro. Gennaro?
Yeah.
Willie?
Yes.
Hi.
Arunima, good
How are you?
afternoon. I'm very happy to see you,
Yes, and
but
I'm
I
happy
hope
to
to meet
see
you
you
in
also.
person as soon as
I
possible.
hope so. Yeah.
Thank you for your work. Very important for the research on time of love, love as a revolution, and I bring you the greetings from the Working Group Society and Emotions of ISA. Thank you, Sylvia, William, and Jay too, for this meeting. And I like to emphasize this work because helps to consolidate the concept of social love. In particular in the interpretative work of society. I'd like to do a comparative work between the tradition of suspended goods that we have studied in our experience and this seva tradition. I think there are in different cultural contexts some threads that are common and different too. I think both phenomena express resistance to the cumulative logic of capitalism from one side, and the other side, both phenomena are examples of the production of common goods. I think this is a crucial theme of our time because we need to produce common common goods to respond the challenge of our time. For example, in particular now, I think to challenge to climate change from one side and the individual happiness too, because if we stay together, we can to produce our recognition for singular, for every person, every individual. I think this experience are in this sense, and the social love. I think we are studying in different contexts how social love produce common goods. I think this is a crucial question of our time. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you so much.
So thank you. Willie, would you like to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, Arunima, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very enlightening also because sometimes we get trapped in our little silos of the piece of the world. So it's so nice to see the commonalities between us. I cannot wait to read the work that you did about the unloving citizen. I mean, even though you say that it's something early, because
I'm happy to send you all a PDF. I'm very happy to do that.
Just the link and we can go and download it, so that increases also your. But I was trying to say, the politics
No,
of
it's fine.
academia.
It's very expensive.
You know what? But one of the things that I love this kind of because we're in the middle of elections, and the discussions, this, you know, this use and politics of using love and care. I mean, as a feminist, have already thought for a long time, have been used against women, you know, for a long time to manipulate and to control. But then it's so interesting, as you mentioned, how this identification of the unloving citizen, you know, who tend to be always the other, and is the one whose citizenship and alliance to the state is always in question, you know. So I find very interesting, because it's also one of the modus operandis of the state. For me, what is interesting also is if I stay, feel so much empowered to rewrite, you know, the wrongdoings and others and things, but how do they frame, or how they have been able to disassociate love from the discussion of the welfare, like the state responsibility to the other, you know, like I hear, one of the things that they had done is that it's not love to create people who are dependent on the state. So we will not going to provide services for them, you know.
Right.
So that's a very bizarre, because the people are very vulnerable, but it's the way of the state to say, if we help them, we create handicaps, social handicaps, or codependence of the state. So that's something very interesting for me. The book that I recommended is a little biased, because she was one of my professors when I was doing grad school. But the last chapter on the hermeneutics of love is a very interesting one, because it's Chela Sandoval, Methodology of the Press, because she do a little tracing of how, for some communities, especially in this case, communities of color here in the United States, love have been one of the tools that they have mobilized almost parallel to the state, you know. So she started to identify all these other ways of solidarity and care, where the people compensate for the shortcoming or loving of the state, you know. So I find it very interesting as we're trying to figure out, you know, how people mobilize care to each other to survive a state that is feed on vulnerability of others. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to read that. Oh, I saw the PDF here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for sharing.
That's my act of love.
Thank you very much. And I will read it with all my love, because I'm sure I'm going
for
to
the
learn a
common
lot.
good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Jay?
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My curiosity is towards what you said, maybe as a distinguishing factor, self-effacement. I am asking this question, or I'm pointing this out, because in the context of what Sylvia earlier mentioned and Gennaro also picked up, in the context of the dimensions of social love, and Sylvia mentioned, and Gennaro also talked about, comparing, in comparison, or in studying parallel context, in different contexts, parallel scenarios, parallel tendencies. So my curiosity is, when you said self-effacement, especially among the Sikhs, as a distinguishing factor, are there social, cultural, spiritual roots to that? Or is it really just a contemporary manifestation as resistance, or a social critique in response to social realities, or even political factors?
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. Well, you know, this is an essence of Sikhi, the Sikh tradition and the Sikh learning, that all of them speak about. That the only way in which you can think about, you know, honoring the preceptor, the guru, and performing service, seva, is if you have that humility, that it's through self-effacement. So it is something that they all speak about being taught from childhood as part of an essential kind of sort of component of Sikh life. And, you know, not to, you know, toss out simplistic remarks and make it sound very easy or something that is, to make simplistic generalizations. I do think that there is this desire to help, a certain kind of kindness, that everyday acts of kindness matter. This is something purely from a sort of imprecise observational point of view of having grown up in North India and having had Sikh neighbors and Sikh friends and interacted with different members of the community in different contexts. I would say that even though there is a way in which they have been branded as militant separatists, terrorists, in fact, even within the country, because of Khalistan and Sikh separatism and the movement of the late 70s, early 80s, and so on and so forth. Despite that, there is a way in which when you encounter the average Sikh person as opposed to the average Hindu, I would say that you feel that you're in the context of somebody who's kind and who wants to help. So please treat this only as a random observation. It's not based on deep ethnography or anything like that. But I think that there is something about that, about the way in which you are brought up, about how you are taught to be with your neighbors, with people you don't know, the unknown person, the stranger. There is something cultural in terms of, how you're brought up around those kinds of things, rather than, distinguishing on the basis of your social location or your caste, your religion, and so on and so forth. Instead of that, treating the stranger as a family member, everybody becomes part of that larger community, the Sangat. So I think there is something about cultural difference that one can learn from. You don't have to be a Sikh to admire certain kinds of things about the way in which they conduct themselves. And I think the fact of this consistent Langar Seva that they have done in political and social contexts wouldn't have been possible to have maintained it in this kind of way had it not been part of daily forms of learning and everyday acts of self-making, even though self-effacement is the part, sort of intrinsic part of that idea.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll add to that imprecise observation, having lived with them in India, but most especially in Fiji. I have been a recipient of those Langar Sevas also. And yeah, I can confirm to what you've said, but again, it's a personal observation only. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Felipe wanted to say something in the closing. Felipe?
Yeah.
Okay. Only a few words to close.
Yeah, no, just for saying thank you so much for this inspiring thoughts of how very concretely we could think on the theme of the social love and the political, social, institutional consequence that we can take for it. And I think your work, your research is so inspiring in that way. If you are working, as I said, on the past, but it's very concrete and that's for me is particularly interesting, how to think about the future in a different way, right? And I think if we kind of need this different vocabulary, concepts, in order to think what still is not there, right? It's not the way that we think about institutions and social practice. So your inspiring work, I think it's very rich for thinking this future different than we still have in the present. Thank you so much.
I want to just make this reference to the work of Ariella Azule, the Israeli-born photographer and visual theorist who's been working with Palestinian rights for I think all her life and has written extremely important work on that. She talks about the histories of the future. And, you know, and she goes back to her own shared past for a long, you know, not just her own immediate sort of lifespan, but generations before that, of the way in which Arab peoples, Jewish or Muslim or Christian, have lived together, and what kinds of lessons one can learn from that. And she calls that histories of the future. And I have found that work really, really very important, because I find that listening to resistant voices in countries that have become so, you know, that have swung so much to the right, that I want to actually, you know, think with the kind of work that people have done from those locations of resisting that. And I think that is something that's really been very inspiring for me.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Felipe, for this closing. And thank you, everybody, for being with us. We will invite you, if you are happy, to join us in the future dialogic meetings. But I wanted to, to say very much thank you to Arunima. It was very inspiring, really, really, on the practical sense, but also, it was food for thought a lot, because with a lot of questions about our connections and the interconnections, about the new glasses for looking at the social reality, and also challenges for the future. So thank you very much for everybody. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Have a nice Saturday. Bye-bye.
Ciao, thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.